My name's Matthew Rigby. I've had the pleasure of working with Lindsay all over the state in lots of schools with years 11 and 12 doing QCS test coaching workshops. Lindsay's a bit of a legend. He's going to be talking about focusing on EA4, the analytical essay, as a literary interpretation. So I'll hand over to Lindsay.
Thanks, mate. Everyone able to hear me okay? Kind of. 1 minute. Is that better? Is that better? Yes? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you, Matt, and thank you everyone for hanging around this afternoon. I hope I make it worthwhile. The session that I'm going to do this hour, I was specifically asked by Julie to talk about the final external exam genre, which is analytical essay, and I'll put that in inverted commas for the time being. People who have heard me speak about this before will already know why I'm putting inverted commas. But it's actually part of probably a three-part session in some ways. At the state conference this year for ETAC, some of you might have seen me talking about analysing complex texts and a bit of a framework for doing that. And really, unless you've done that, you can't do this bit. So I'll talk a bit about that. But for those people who are coming tomorrow, there is a sort of follow-up session to this where I'm going to talk about some, because I think one of the points Katie made was very good, that there are different ways of doing the analytical essay because there's actually different genres that can fit under that umbrella term analytical essay. So what I'm going to do is just talk about a couple of different approaches in the time that I've got available, which is 2 hours in total. Which, as you'll see, and as you've already seen today, isn't actually as much as what it sounds. So, oops, let me turn this on, might help. Right, so this is what I've been asked to do today, was to really just make sure that people go away with a pretty confident understanding of what analytical essay means. And for a lot of you, I'm sure that this will simply, you'll go, well, yeah, that's great, but that's sort of what I already thought. If that's what you go away with, that's good as well, because I was talking to someone earlier today, and we were just talking about people's, feelings at the moment this year, and it's been interesting that about 2 years ago I was saying to schools, look, you really want to be thinking about preparing kids for this now, because if you're trying to do it in a couple of years' time, you're probably leaving it a little bit late. And, some people start to make a little bit of movement. I walked into a lot of schools this year, and it's sort of like deers in the headlight stuff, where people are suddenly realising, there's a lot going on here. So what I'm going to talk about anyway is that obviously hit a chord because there weren't any laughter about that, but anyway, maybe I find that funnier as an outsider. So what I'm going to try to do is basically talk about the detail of the analytical essay, a bit of contextual stuff, a bit of theoretical stuff, but also, I hope, really practical look at the inner workings of analytical essay as well, down to a language sort of level. And as I said, what I'd hope that you'd go away with this is feeling a lot more confident about it, but also really thinking about scoping and sequencing from Year 7, which once again is just reinforcing a message which Katie had earlier. All right, now I just want to mention this very briefly because unless you do this bit, the next bit, the analytical essay, is pretty pointless. And I have in the past talked about a framework, a transferable framework that you can give kids to analyse any novel at all. Now, I'm not going to talk about that in any detail. I just want to signal that, and I am giving the PowerPoints to Julie, so she'll be putting them up on the members part of the ETAC website, so you'll be able to get access to it there. And the other point that I've been making, and I got a big laugh at this, it was one of those Trump-type laughs where people laughing at me, not with me. But it was, I just made the point that really, if you were taking the task seriously as a student, you'd really be reading the novel roughly 3 times. The first time just for enjoyment, the second time to do those annotations and note-taking, and a third time we're sort of sorting the stuff out. Now, realistically, we know that not every kid's going to do that, but I just want to make the point that if you want to do well, that's the way, or otherwise you just go and read as many of the, e-notes and that as you can find about the book, I suppose. All right, now let's get into analytical essay then, and the first point I want to make is why I put inverted commas around the word essay. And the answer comes from QCAA itself. This is a quote from the 2015 retrospective. And it's certainly my experience working in schools with teachers that, and when you look across syllabuses, I don't know how many of you looked across a number of syllabuses, but lots of the syllabuses talk about the kids writing essays. But what they mean about writing an essay is very different from what we mean about writing an essay. And, that's really, I think, a problematic aspect of using the term essay, although I understand why, having spent about 15 years when I was teaching on subject advisory committees, I do understand, when you're catering for a wide range of people and when you're having to write a compromised document, why you'd settle for a term like essay. So I'm not being critical. What we do know, and if you have a look on page 2 of your handouts. Thank you, I forgot about them. Right, let's just take a little pause before I talk about the handout while we get handouts distributed. Thank you for remembering. All right, now I just will talk about... Thank you, Julie. I'm glad someone does. I'll try not to forget in the morning. This is what happens when you get caught up in conversations about flooring people before you come in. We're getting a quote on flooring. It was about double what I was expecting. I was sending a horrified email, texts to my wife about it. All right, now, if you go to page 2 of the handout when it comes, what I've provided there is not a complete list of all the genres that exist, but these are, this is based on really 50 years worth of research by people in systemic functional linguistics, where they've looked closely at lots, it would be collectively it would be tens of thousands of student texts. And out of that research, what they've been able to do is to classify genres in a fairly technical sort of way. And in English, we tend to deal with the story, argument and response to cultural work genres. They tend to be the 3 sort of families of genres which we deal with the most. Now, you'll see that under response to cultural works is a couple down the bottom there, interpretation and critical evaluation, which are the ones which we want to focus on here. And what I'm going to argue is that analytical essay in terms of what's meant in terms of this technical category of genres, that is interpretation and critical evaluation. You'll see there's comparative interpretation in there. If you have a look at some of the books that have been written, so for example, there's a great book by Pauline Jones and Bev Daravianka on teaching language in context, published by Oxford. And the example they give of an interpretation text is a comparative interpretation. Thank God we don't have to do comparative interpretations in the external exam, is all I'm going to say. I think the kids are going to struggle enough with an interpretation, let alone a comparative one. And of course, that comparative element will come into the IA1, I think it is, isn't it? Where they have to do the two texts and representations across two texts, but not necessarily interpretation, I might add. All right, so that's where it fits in terms of what we're doing. So what I'm going to argue is that and what I've been arguing for some time is that when you look at the exemplars in particular that were provided by QCAA for the external test trials, when I've seen stuff that kids are writing in schools, it really fits most closely into this interpretation genre. And what we're doing is interpreting the messages or aesthetics of a culturally significant work, including texts. So even though you're going to see the word theme used in a convenient sense, what we're talking about is not just, what's the message in terms of what's the moral of the story, but, things like, the aesthetics and how the aesthetics are working in the text, etc. as well. What's the sort of feeling that might be generated, or the cultural values underpinning the text, etc. So it's a fairly broad definition that we're using, because meaning can be all sorts of things. It's not just, the moral of the story, so to speak. And Rothery and Stenglen back in 1997, in their research, made the point that a student, mastery of the genre demonstrates that a student is able to read the message of the text and hence be able to respond to the cultural values presented in the narrative. And I reckon that's pretty close to, a lot of the wording of what that task is going to be about in the syllabus as well. And this is what the syllabus says. You've seen this already. The purpose is to communicate an informed and critical perspective of the text in response to an unseen question or task studied in depth in Unit 4. I had to put a sick after that because it sounds like the unseen question or task is being studied in depth in Term 4. And that's straight from the syllabus, so someone might want to go back and just have a little edit of that page there. Now, one of the things that I know that we talk about the thesis stage a lot is that, stage in the genre where kids state their position that they're taking in the argument that they're making. And I've done this before in detail at ETAC over a couple of seminars, but I just want to very briefly provide a rationale for why I prefer to distinguish these two types of essays, distinguish the persuasive essay from the exposition, from the interpretation. Now, on the left, let's get my hands right, on your left, that's an exposition, that's an actual persuasive essay that Year 9 wrote in North Queensland for NAPLAN. She got a perfect score in every criteria. All right, so this is, I think we can class this as a pretty classic exposition. On the right is a interpretation that I wrote of a short story that I wrote as an exemplar, so I didn't have to worry about copyright issues and all that sort of thing. Now, a couple of things. You don't need to read through this in detail. You can do this when you get the PowerPoints. But a couple of things I want to show you that distinguishes them and why I think it's important that kids really have a clear distinction in their mind about these genres. In the thesis stage of the exposition, one of the things the kids are doing is establishing their role and their personal credibility as writers. Then, and you'll see that the topic they're writing about is a general topic. Too much money is being spent on toys and games. On the other hand, you'll see that what's thematised or put up front in the literary interpretation is the literary text. So it's not trying to establish this interpersonal relationship with the reader. What it's trying to, in order to hopefully persuade them, but what it's doing instead is putting the text up front in the argument. It states what, in this case, it is, of course this is Year 9, it's a very morals, what's the moral sort of thing. And the arguments are based on elements of the story. Okay, elements of the story. Then when we get to the argument stage, in the exposition, the arguments and elaborations are based on general knowledge about the topic. Right, because that's what you have to do in that plan. If you've got time, then you maybe do a bit of research. My pointer's not working, my battery's obviously a bit flat. Whereas in the and the editorial itself that supposedly this was inspired by is not referenced at all in the argument stage. Whereas when you get to the interpretation, the argument is based on a close reading of the text. Right? Another really significant difference between the two genres. And then in the conclusion, the reiteration stage in the exposition, the theme reiteration stage in the interpretation, notice the reiterations based on the general issue and the arguments that have been put forward, whereas the reiteration refers to the message and the elements of the text that were used to support that. So there is no doubt that the interpretation genre, or we'll use the use the QCAA term, analytical essay, is a type of argument, but it's a very different type of argument from the persuasive sort of essays that kids write for NAPLAN. And they really need to understand that that distinction exists. And when you look at, I know these are were first draft of the sort of topics, but when you look at the topics, these topics, this was, I think, the sample topics for the original trial exam from memory. Someone correct me if I was wrong. Yeah, and but when you look at any of the topics, these are not arguments about general issues. These are text-based arguments, and if they're text-based arguments, then by logically they have to be interpretations. Okay. Now that doesn't mean that you won't call them analytical essays, but you just need to, have that distinction clear in your mind that essay gets used very broadly, and we've got different types of essays, and we need to make those different types of essays really clear and distinct for the kids. Okay, so if we're talking about an interpretation, what are the register considerations? In other words, what are they writing about? What role are they taking on? Who's their audience? What's the relationship? What's the mode and medium? Well, some of this, the stuff in black that I'm about to put up is implied. The stuff in red is straight from the syllabus. So the field, well, we know it's going to be literary analysis and aspects of a specific novel or play contributing to messages of various types in it. Possibly that should have been in red. I'm not quite sure why I didn't put it in red. In terms of roles and relationships, they're really just taking on the role here of a Year 12 student. They're not being asked to jump through any more hoops than that. And I think that's a sensible thing for something like for external exams. And to be honest, I was quite happy to see that that was what was going to be the external exam genre, and not something like a short story to be written under test conditions. Now, straight from the syllabus, though, is the reader is an audience with a deep understanding of the text. And if you go to page 52, it also elaborates on that, saying an educated reader familiar with the literary text being discussed. The relationship, the syllabus just says formal tone. What does that mean in a more technical sense? It means that there's a bit of social distance between the writer and the reader, so they're not sitting next to you and you're able to just ask you questions. They're not your best buddy or anything. There's this distance between you. You have less power in many respects, let's be honest, than what the markers do. And finally, there's the expectation, this is a really important point, that the writer and reader will share a literary sensibility even though your interpretations might vary. Now, I just want to dwell and obviously the mode's written. They're not asked to draw little pictures or anything to go along with it, clearly. Now, I just want to elaborate a little bit on this bit here because, we're not the first state to mandate this sort of writing for exams. Therefore, particularly for the HSC, there's been quite a lot of research done over a lot of time. And in the, there's a book out on the ETAC book table called, can't remember the full name, but it's by Mary Macken-Hararick, Carmel Sanderlin, Len Unsworth and others. And that's part of a research they did over 3 years where they looked at 3 different genres. They looked at, 1 year they looked at teaching exposition, 1 year they looked at teaching narrative, 1 year they looked at teaching interpretation. And what came out of that research, or one of the many things that came out of that research, was that they discovered that different types of readings garnered higher or lower marks. Now, none of this will surprise you. It just really sets up for what I'm going to say in a minute. So you won't be surprised to know that a tactical reading where the kid said something like, there's just some mention of this stupid mockingbird all through the book. Who knows what that was all about? Surprise, surprise, they don't do very well. Surprise, surprise, kids who do what's technically called a diegetic reading where they just retell the story, they don't do very well. The kids who do well, and we can forget about the top ones because it's really the current English extension syllabus is really where you do those ones. But what got good marks was where kids made a semiotic reading. In other words, they interpreted the symbolic significance of patterns in a text. And I want to emphasise that last bit, patterns in a text. It is not enough to make some sort of claim about the novel and then provide an example to back that up. What the kids have to demonstrate is that there is a pattern of examples that you can detect and identify in the book which lead me to think this about what the book means. And I've talked to some of the schools I've worked in over the years about some of their exemplars that they had written even for younger kids for interpretation. And one of the problems I had with them is they often had this very structured these very structured peel paragraphs where the kids where even the teacher model that was written said, this is the point that I want to make, this is a bit of elaboration on it, this is a single piece of evidence to back that up, and then some sort of concluding sentence. And having, as I said, if you want to get the higher marks, it's not enough. You need this pattern in the text. So, let me show you an example of the sort of thing that I'm talking about. This is this question here, and this is on the top of page 3 for you. This was based on a book called Lady Helen and the Dark Days Clock. So I'm just trying to be a good teacher and not write an exemplar directly based on the book the kids are reading here. And this topic that I've got here is one that was based on one of the real topics that was set for one of the trial exams. I've just adapted it for the specific book. There were easier ones I could have chosen, but I don't know whether anyone had a go at this topic or remembers this topic, but it was pretty difficult. It was pretty challenging. And one of the reasons I decided to have a go at it as the exemplar that I wrote was that I had to think about how that would stretch my knowledge of the genre. So what I'll get you to, of course, if your kid's doing that test, obviously you want the kids to be analysing that question, pulling it apart, working out what is it actually asking me to do, etc., annotating in that sort of way. All right, once again, you can look at that in detail. All right, so in order to respond to that question, I need to think about, okay, how am I going to structure it? And there's been a few different, or there's a couple of competing models of what the interpretation genre looks like. They're not really, I'd say competing, but they're not really competing in that way. Just a couple of different ways of labelling them. I tend not to like the synopsis of text as a stage because it's not actually what they mean that you just summarise what happens in the book. But I think that's the signal it's going to send to kids. So what I prefer is the one that Daravienka and Jones uses, which is theme identification and preview of elements, element evaluation, theme reiteration. And this actually, and you'll notice that it's not just describe what's happening, but evaluate what's happening as you're describing. Okay, so that's pretty important. Now, if we put that alongside, and Katie will be very happy to know that I have read this from the syllabus, that if you put that structure alongside the syllabus glossary definition, I think you can create a synthesis of the two that will keep everyone happy, which is why in a minute, okay? Won't be too many laughs in here, so here's one. But I think you can produce a bit of a synthesis of the two that will keep most people pretty happy. And I don't want to come in here try and be a Puritan because I'm not trying to say that you use the word interpretation. I know you can't do that. You're just going to confuse kids if you do it. You have to use the term analytical essay, but I think we need to be clear. My argument is really we need to be really clear on what we mean when we're talking about analytical essay, as opposed, for example, to persuasive essay. All right, and you'll see that that's, I think works pretty well. It encaptures the syllabus stuff and encaptures Daravienka and Jane's more technical analysis of the genre as well. Now, don't worry, we are going to talk about this in more detail. I know I've skipped over that fairly quickly. But what I'm going to we're just going to suspend time for 3 minutes, and we're going to, I'm going to get you to have a read of at least part of the exemplar I've written for this. It's on page 3 and 4, and without cheating and turning over the page to page 4 and 5, just see, I'll put it back to the structure in a minute, but just see if you can identify the structure. So I'll give you 3 minutes to have a bit of a read, and then we'll come back together. And I'll just, oops, what have I done? Okay, and I'll just put that up there as well so you can look for that as you go. I should have mentioned it's just a fraction over 1,000 words, so it's within the sort of word length which is set in the syllabus for Year 11. All right. We'll just stop there. Look, I know you might not have got the whole lot finished. Probably one other thing I should have said, yes, it does have page references in there, but this was assuming they were doing it at the end of year 11, where they would be able to do it not in test conditions. They'd have a bit of time to work on. So it's written more as a year 11 exemplar. The other thing I'd say is that I know some of the language is a little bit higher pitched, but if they don't hear it from us and they don't live in the Wentworth electorate, who are they going to hear it from? Okay, so I do believe we need to push kids a little bit with language. All right, now if you now turn over to page 4 and 5, I've actually done a bit of hard work which took me a while to do, and that is that I've summarised both, tried to analyse that according to the structure, which we'll talk a little bit in more detail in a minute, but there's also a bit of analysis by language features per stage as well. I know that one of the things which, these 3-column analyses aren't uncommon in schools. One thing I'd warn about them is it's that final column for language features. You should try to do it a bit stage by stage, because language features do change between stages when you're looking at texts. All right, now we're basically going to spend the rest of the time here just going through some of this. Now, you would have seen the interpretation stage. Now, people who are familiar with, who have done reading to learn, anyone done reading to learn? Okay, if you've done reading to learn, you'll be fairly familiar with the idea of phases, which is roughly they're a sub-stage within a stage, all right? Now, I know that, we need to be careful about screwing things down too tight for kids so that they end up writing something formulaic. But I also think that it's a recipe for disaster if you don't teach kids a reasonably tight sort of structure. And particularly for the weaker kids, it will be a complete disaster. They're just going to ramble otherwise. The second thing I want to try to demonstrate is, even though this is fairly tightly screwed down in terms of structure, I don't think anyone would have read that going, well, that's so formulaic. Okay? But the reality is that if we want them to be able to, if you want the kids to be able to, or if you want, as the markers, to be able to tell a mobile phone case from a cup, then they actually need to know what are the distinctive features about those two things. So, that's why these are pretty important. Now, what I'm going to do is, you've actually got, I didn't actually put this into the handout, and I realised this morning I probably should have, so it'll be in the thing. I didn't do the phases for the introduction, but these are the 3 basic things that you would expect to see in an introduction for an interpretation. You don't have to start some sort of hook to grab the reader's attention, I don't think, for an interpretation. I'd just be saying, just get into it and do it. Okay? You don't want to be boring, but you also don't want to, spend too much time getting into it. Now, if you compare that to... oh, no, we're not doing that yet. Okay, that must be... it's tomorrow morning I do the other. Okay, so that's the introduction. Then, and that doesn't look that different from, a persuasive essay, except that, once again, we're making the text the focus of this piece of writing. Then, and this is... Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah, I just need to ask a question. So
Yeah.
you've got theme identification.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people teach that, let's just say, the second sentence or third sentence, the middle sentence.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are teaching that as a thesis.
Yeah.
Tell me about that language. Tell me how that's
It is if you're talking about a thesis in general being, because from Greek, if you know the Greek derivation, you probably know that thesis simply means position, your position on an argument. So in some ways, it's what I said before, that there is a family resemblance between the argument genres and the response genres. However, we're not arguing about a general issue, and particularly if you're a linguist, one of the things linguists do is they make sure that things are very distinct. And so to avoid the confusion between thesis, which has been applied to persuasive essay or exposition, they use this term theme identification, because this is the thing, and as I said, theme, if you've ever done any work where you've had to try to find a name to give something, it's really hard to find names that encapsulate it really well. But theme here, I said, is pretty broad because it's in terms of the cultural meanings, the moral sort of meanings, the aesthetic sort of meanings the text has. Okay? And what's really important is that what that term emphasises, I think, which thesis doesn't, is that we're arguing something about a text here and not about a general issue. Now, I'm not saying you can't use the word thesis if that's what you really want to do. I'm not going to be a purist in that way, but for the sake of what I'm doing, I'm trying to make distinctions really clear about what you're doing. Because you don't want kids to get into the exam and go, oh yes, it's terrible that we treat, apes so badly in our society or something. All right? You actually want them to engage with the text, not with the general meanings of the text, if you know what I mean, saying whether they agree or disagree. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And it also makes me think that what we might think of as the thesis here is certainly not contained within one big sentence.
No.
It's certainly across two, not three.
And for this topic, it was hard because what you had to establish was A, what were the values of the society, and then B, whether the character reflected those values or not. So there was actually a two-step process, which actually really makes you flex the genre in some interesting ways, which you'll see right now. So then, and this is on page, I've actually given you this on page 6. This bit I gave you the middle bit, because it's the middle bit where I think the interesting stuff happens. And this is where I think Peel in particular falls down a bit. I think Peel as a way of introducing paragraph structure in middle school is really, really, really useful. And if you've ever seen Sally Humphrey's book, Teaching Academic Writing in the Middle Years, which I actually recommend Sophie they maybe get as an ETAC book to sell, she is able to exploit the Peel paragraph for the middle school in really effective sort of ways. But I think when, we're better off here actually looking to the way that literary analysis has been taught in American colleges and universities. And they actually talk about you're making a claim. That's what your first sentence does. So what the first sentence does is makes the claim that civility is an important principle that guides the upper class in Regency England of the novel. Then it elaborates on that claim. This value placed a premium on good manners, politeness and decorum, especially avoiding the appearance of sexual impropriety. And then it provides a pattern of examples in the novel that support that claim. And you can read that pattern of examples for yourself. Notice anything missing? There's no concluding sentence because the concluding sentence comes at the end of the next paragraph. This is really the setup to what we're trying to... Remember I said it's a two-step process. The first step is to say, these are the values in the society. So what I'm claiming and supporting through my examples is this is the pattern, these are the values that underpin this society as represented in the novel. And then I go on and make the claim, however, through the... and notice I'm setting up a contrast already, so I'm already signalling, even though they are the values in that society, I've got a signal here saying, but this isn't necessarily the way that they influence Lady Helen. So, however, through the choice of Lady Helen as the focaliser and third-person narrator, so bringing in some of that, the aesthetic features and figurative language stuff, try and bring that, integrate that into my discussion, the reader becomes aware that she recognises this civility as a veneer that masks hypocrisy and violence. And then a bit of an elaboration of that. Then a pattern of examples that supports that, and then, crucially, not a linking paragraph, not a linking sentence, which was what Peel would have, but what the Americans would talk about as a warrant. And the warrant is is a linking sentence, but what it does is it links the evidence to your claim. So you're establishing the chain of logic. That's what the warrant's about. You're saying, this is my claim, this is my evidence, this is how my evidence links to the claim that I'm making. And that's why that doesn't come right until the very end of those two paragraphs, because I need to set up what the values are in the society, then talk about how they influence Lady Helen or not, and then finish with my warrant. So, as the example demonstrates, and I think it's good to teach kids, little phrases like that they can use, because there's not a lot of them that you would use. You'd use reveal, show, something like that. Lady Helen recognised the need to comply with social expectations around civility, but only to the point where a larger duty to herself and others comes into play. Any questions about that? Julie? No, I'm only joking. Does that make sense? Yes, okay. And then when we get to the final paragraph, and I'm not going to do the next two paragraphs because they follow the same pattern, but when we get to the final paragraph, then what we're basically doing is just reiterating what we've said before, and it's pretty typical. It's not necessary, but it's pretty typical that what you do is also finish with a little comment which links the text to the present day. That's what we tend to do because we have this literary sensibility. So the comment is a bit optional, but we tend to do it anyway. Okay? All right, so that's the structure, and I hope that what you'll see is those little sub-stages are useful, but they're not, and I think they provide that extra level of scaffolding for the kids without it having to be tied down so tight that they start producing this really formulaic sort of writing. But I'll tell you what, if a kid produced a formulaic piece of writing and got 13 out of 20, what's the marking out of? 20 or 25. So if they got, 15 out of 25 instead of 9 out of 25, I'd probably be a pretty happy teacher, to be honest. And that's why I think, giving that little bit of extra level of scaffolding is good, but of course pushing your better kids to exploit that scaffolding as well, as I've had to do here, because what it demonstrates is that you can't walk in, and I think this is the challenge we've got, you can't walk in to the exam and go, I'm going to be able to use that structure exactly as the teacher gave me. In fact, you need to analyse what the question requires and then think about how you're going to deploy that typical structure in order to answer the question that you've got. So I think that would be, I think we, Katie and I would be on the same wavelength there. Yeah. All right, now, so look, just final chance. Any other questions about structure there? Yeah.
WA.
Oh, okay.
I really like the different language that they've given us to teach this. As someone who doesn't live in the state, I would worry about students losing the question. So
Mm.
literally, use the word hammer. It hammers
Yeah.
the question already, and I can see it evolve all the way through those 3 paragraphs. Would you advise that that is a preparation for the upper level of students, or would you start with that form with the whole class?
Yeah, look, it's part of the problem trying to do this in an hour. Of course, you leave out as much as what you can put in, as you'd be well aware. But, there's a whole lot of, stuff about how you model, how you do joint construction, how you do collaborative writing, get kids doing collaborative writing before they do the independent writing. And I think that, a lot of this you can teach as you go. Like, I think you can do this 2 things at once, to be honest. I think you can do some pulling apart of the structure, as well as, for the better kids, drawing attention to ways the structure's been, deployed in, more sophisticated ways to do exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about. Although, keeping to the question is obviously going to be useful for the better kids as well as the weaker kids, I would think. Does that answer the question? Sorry, that's a pretty general answer, but yeah. And look, this example I've got here is clearly meant as an A-level, using the old language, an A-level exemplar. Using C samples to bring out some of that might be worthwhile for those kids as well. All right. I am going to move on because just to bring this home, I just want to talk about 4 language features that might be useful to consider when you're teaching the stuff that's going to be pretty important. Now, nominalisation, hopefully I don't need to do too much of a grammar lesson with this group, but nominalisation is where you turn words that aren't nouns into nouns. And I've highlighted up there the nouns and noun groups that have been used where this happens. And what that allows me to do is to write this fairly compact 35-word sentence. Now, if we unpack that and don't use nominalisation, this is what something like what we would have ended up with. Now, not wrong, it's just that it's not packaging the information up in A, a concise way, and B, in a way that makes you sound really smart, to put it fairly crudely. Nominalisation does a lot more than that, but, let's face it, the bottom line is we want kids to sound smart, and if you use it, that's the ultimate goal of using nominalisation, not overusing it either, but, using it just right. So nominalisation is definitely one of the things that kids are going to have to learn to do really effectively. And if you have a look at the Australian curriculum, end of year 8 is where kids are supposed to be emerging with their nominalisation. So we're not talking about something that is, year 12, first year, third year university writing here. And by the way, if you've read all that plain English stuff which says that you shouldn't use nominalisations, read Jim Martin's book on de-vilifying nominalisation and you'll get the other side of the story, because if you can't nominalise, then you're actually in big trouble. You're in big trouble if you want any sort of academic career. Okay, now, one that I want to spend a little bit longer on, and tomorrow morning I'm going to sort of elaborate on this as well. But evaluative language, hopefully a lot of people are familiar with the appraisal network, where in terms of evaluative language, there's 3 types of words we use to express attitudes. So we use feeling words, so things like I love, I'm happy, I'm satisfied, etc. We use judgment words, where we judge whether people or characters in books, and just keep that in the back of mind, are normal, capable, tenacious, honest, or beyond reproach. And we use appreciation words, and the appreciation words are ones which we use to appreciate things that are not human. So things like human behaviour. So things like landscapes, books, artworks, timber flooring, whatever you might like to think. I know it's on my mind. They're the sorts of things we do appreciation of. Have a look at, remember, pink is for feelings, and by the way, don't blame me, it was actually female linguists who came up with this coding. Pink is for feelings, blue is for judgments, green is for appreciation. That's the thesis stage of that essay. What do you notice? No feelings. It's not about whether we like the book, whether we dislike the book. And obviously, because the sort of text we're writing, the response text, we're really doing an appreciation of the novel. That's what we're doing when we're evaluating it. But the question calls for us to make judgments about the character. And I would think that, it would be highly strange, I would have thought, to get some sort of topic eventually that won't have any mention of the characters in it at all. So the broad range of words used for characters is important. Now, what you'll notice though, because this is the thesis stage, there's a lot of stuff about evaluating the text as such and the author's construction of the characters and that. When we get to the element evaluation stage, where we're talking about civility, notice that the focus has shifted. So, and this is why I said it's useful to look at where you use things according to the stages and phases, not just giving kids a general list of use these language features. So here you'll notice that the appreciation words really appear in that first sentence. Civility is an important principle. Just at the beginning of the second one, this value placed on premium, on good manners, politeness, etc. So there's that, but most of that paragraph is about making judgments. Okay, because we're talking about the values of that society, what they value in behaviour. And then, when we get back to the reiteration, we get back to that more balance between we're making final evaluations of the book, but in respect to behaviours that are constructed through the book as well. Now, as I said, I'll be talking about that in a bit more detail tomorrow, but one of the things that I'll just say for the people who aren't here is that what you would want to see, and this sort of picks up on that point about the question being able to be seen all through the essay, even though it's not mentioned, is these are the things, sorry, it's not pointing, but these are the things which you will then find elaborated on through the piece. So it's a lot of that evaluation which is what's picked up in each paragraph then. So that when you get to the end, those same sorts of things are picked up on in the conclusion as well. And that's part of what makes the link between the three parts of the essay. And this is a tweet recently to that Merger movie that came out. And notice here, okay, that's that language of feeling. And one of the things which we have to do is help kids make that move from, and this is scope and sequencing, that move from personal response to reviews and interpretations. Being able to change things like I hated to an appreciation word like appalled. Or I loved Bridget Terabithia. Bridget Terabithia was sublime. I actually hated it, but that's another story. And I've got a couple of ways you can do that there. Now look, citing and quoting I won't do a lot on, but if you turn to page 7, I've given you 5 examples of the way that quotes have been incorporated into the text. And this is one of the things that I hear people talk about a lot, that kids struggle with incorporating text, integrating them into the fabric of the piece. And the big key message that I want to give based on page 7 is that students have to learn a variety of techniques for incorporating evidence into their essays. I think that's the key message that comes from that page. And the point that I make somewhere is this isn't an exhaustive list. This is just a list of some of the ways that I've done, and I'm sure there's other ways of doing it as well.
It's on page 7.
What's on? Yeah, page 7. Oh, did I say page 6? Sorry. Yeah, page 7. Have you got? Oh, maybe you've got tomorrow's handout instead of today's handout. Okay, that's useful. Okay, that's all right. We'll fix that up at the end. Okay, we'll fix that up at the end. And look, finally, one thing which people talk to me about a lot going around schools is that cohesion is a big problem for kids. And if you have a look across that text, there's a whole range of cohesive devices used. The one that I want to emphasise though is that part-whole one, because I think for the interpretation of the analytical essay, it's really important that people understand, that kids understand that they're also building up a bit of a taxonomy through their essay as well. And they're talking about bits in the appropriate place. So I'm talking about the novel, but I'm talking about narration, setting, characters, aesthetic features. Under narration, I'm talking about the focaliser, who sees and who speaks, who's Lady Helen, who's the hero, who speaks, well, it's in third person. If we go over to aesthetic features, I talk, for example, about motifs and symbols, etc. So, having that notion of you can build up your text in this way, I think is pretty useful. And look, just to, this is more to get you thinking more than anything, but I sat down with a piece of brainstorming software and just tried to map out all the things that kids need to know in order to be able to write an effective interpretation or analytical essay. That's what I came up with. And I've sort of dealt with a smidgen of those today. And what you can use that to do, of course, is to go, if you do that sort of stuff as a group or as a team, is to go back and do a bit of backward mapping and to work out what kids need to learn in order to do it in various different... Because it's not just about language features, it's about cognitive processes. I refuse to use the word cognitions. I'm not actually being convinced that's actually a real word, but cognitive processes, the skills, literary knowledge they need, as well as that language knowledge they need as well. It's really big. And we haven't even talked about then being able to use the writing process effectively under test conditions. So, yeah. So what I will leave you with, which you might find helpful though, this is from Humphrey's book, is she actually maps out the scope and sequence for teaching response as kids do description, review, analysis, including character analysis, compositional analysis, as a bridge to writing, interpretations and critical responses. And it's the critical responses that I'll talk more about tomorrow, because it's those critical responses that really give scope for kids to do resistant readings, which I think, given the diversity, in inverted commas, of the external exam texts, is something important that we need to consider in schools, and I'll expand on that tomorrow. So that's what you might want to think about. Hopefully that's your confidence. You know, the rain's coming down with confidence. Of course, you've got the nice raincoat on. Here's the lab. Because a lot of what I've talked about is actually covered in detail in chapter 7 of that book.
Questions, please. The questions for Lindsay, ladies and gentlemen?
Hell no, we want to get home.
Should we add that if you're here to have tomorrow's handout, we'll see, we've got more in the box, so we can always do a swap for you. So please come down afterwards and we can get that sorted.
And I take responsibility for that, for not sorting that out before I started. Any questions? No?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, could you join me in thanking Lindsay? At some very, very good schools like at Tully State High School and Innisfail State College, students can parrot back to me the 4 kinds of lexical cohesion, but he's right, we have to teach kids cohesion and how to incorporate quotations in different kinds of ways. A really interesting session. Could you join me in thanking Lindsay?